So my dad calls me up and says, hey, could you help me upgrade my old iMac? Or maybe even buy a new one if that's not the option. And I said, well, sure, but what's the problem with the current one? Well, he really wants to speed up the entire system in general. In everyday use, it seems like the iMac is just slowly degrading in performance. And while that could be for a number of reasons, like simple driver issues to maybe hardware failure, it could also just be the fact that the iMac is an older model and the operating systems being launched today are being optimized for the new iMacs being sold. Anyway, I said to him, let's take a look at it and see if there's something we can do. His current system is an older one. It's a 21.5-inch model 10.1 and it's from late 2009. They had an E7600 processor, 4GB of DDR3 memory, NVIDIA GeForce graphics, and a standard 3.5-inch mechanical hard drive. His iMac has been upgraded a little bit already though, with another 8GB of DDR3 memory, and the standard mechanical hard drive has been switched for a much faster solid-state drive that utilizes the full speed of the SATA 2 interface. But with that already done, option 1 of upgrading the system is actually proving pretty limited. We can max out the memory to 16GB, we could switch out the processor for the Intel E8600 model, but I doubt that's going to give much of a noticeable difference in the end, and though it's a relatively cheap option, switching the processor involves taking apart the entire iMac, and with little to no gain in the end, we just went on to option 2, which is a new one. Okay, so the current baseline iMac is the model 18.1, it's from mid-2017, and it has an Intel i5 processor with 8GB of DDR4 memory. It has Intel on-chip graphics in the form of Iris HD 640, and it has a standard 1TB 3.5-inch SATA 3 drive. Now, because of the slightly higher tax rates here in Scandinavia where I live, all of that will actually cost you just over $1,500. And if you were to upgrade the memory to 16GB and switch the old mechanical hard drive for the Apple branded M.2 drive, we would have a very fast iMac, but also a price tag of over $2,000. And with that price, you're still only getting a dual-core system, because the baseline iMac uses an Intel 7360U processor, which, though an i5 and with hyper-threading, is still only 2 cores. Now, comparing it to his much older Wolfdale, it is a big upgrade, getting more than double the score in single-core and almost 3 times the score in multi-core. And the Intel on-chip graphics is just tearing through his old GeForce 9000 series, being better by almost 1000% in everything, and we'll get a nice glimpse of that in the benchmarking later on. But looking at a $2,000 price tag and not necessarily $2,000 worth of hardware, I looked at my dad and I said, we're gonna go option 3. Alright, so for option 3 we're gonna need a motherboard. I have chosen a Mini ITX simply because it is the smallest form factor I can find that still retains a lot of upgradability. We'll need an all-in-one solution though, meaning Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, sound, M.2 support, everything needs to be on here already. We're putting all of this in a very small case, meaning we don't have any room for expansion cards. Next up is the processor, and because we're building small and don't have any room for a physical graphics card, this is where the Intel on-chip graphics is going to make a perfect solution. We're going to need low-profile CPU cooling, not because the stock Intel cooler is bad, but simply because it is too tall to fit in the case. For hard drive, we're going to go with an M.2, and if possible, one that has non-volatile memory. We're also going to need some DDR4 memory. Now, I would say at the bare minimum get 8GB, and I would personally prefer to get 16. Because Mac OS and Windows don't have the same keyboard layout, we needed to buy a new one matching the system we're about to install. We need a monitor with full HD resolution and a screen size of around 21.5 inches, and last but not least, a standard Windows 10 Home license. The case for all of this is the Chieftec iX01B, which is the smallest case I could possibly find. This will barely fit the Mini ITX board. It has a Pico PSU-like power supply and a power brick that will sustain 90 watts, which is more than enough for this build. The only bad thing about the case was that the rubber feet underneath were sort of sticking to my table. Every time I moved it a little bit, they would make marks, but have no fear, bibbidi bobbidi boom, 4 new rubber feet later, and we're off to the next step. Okay, so inside this small case, our all-in-one solution is going to be the MSI H270i Gaming Pro motherboard. It comes with dual-band AC Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.2, an M.2 slot that has non-volatile memory support, USB 2 and 3.1, sound card, Ethernet, and of course supports the Intel on-chip graphics. Our processor is an Intel Core i3-7100, 2 cores, 4 threads, and punching in almost the same numbers as the 7360U processor from the current line iMac, being ahead by 257 points in single core and behind by a mere 64 points in multi-core. And to cool it, we need this. This is a Noctua NH-L9i low-profile CPU cooler. And we need it because the stock Intel cooler is just a bit too tall to fit the case. Mounting it is really easy. 4 screws, put on the little ninja cable, and this baby goes deadly silent. And I mean deadly. I had to check several times to make sure it was actually running. The M.2 slot is located on the bottom side, and it fits both the 2230, 2260, and the 2280 models, which is the one we're going to be using. Because we're fitting a Corsair Force MP500. This is a PCI Express 3.0 M.2 drive, and because it uses non-volatile memory, it makes it super fast. It mounts basically as most laptop memory. Set it in the socket at an angle of about 30 degrees, press gently down on the top, and secure it to the motherboard. The final missing piece is memory, and here we got 16GB DDR4 HyperX Fury from Kingston. Assembling everything outside the case was easy. Getting it all to fit inside the case proved a lot more painful. Because of the orientation of the board, some of the cables just ended up being in the way of each other. Pin cables would come loose or disconnect, and putting them back on was an impossible mission with the tight space. And getting the memory blocks under the power cable when fitting the motherboard was the absolute biggest challenge of the day. Because the motherboard is fitted at an angle and the memory blocks have heat spreaders on them that makes them slightly taller, they would hit the power cable going in. Removing the power cable helps getting the motherboard in place, but now these slightly taller memory blocks are in the way of refitting the power cable. This took the better part of an hour before I finally got everything in place. So finally, it's assembled. Lots of power in a very small and very silent case. And I mean very silent, I was still checking up on that fan. Removing the top reveals just how tightly packed everything is. There really isn't a lot of space left over here. And that Noctua low profile fan does a perfect job of just staying clear of the top. Next up, my dad wanted to have the monitor placed on top of the case so it didn't take up any more space than the old one. But because that is where the fan sucks in all the cold air, it will spell disaster if we actually cover that up. So I took some simple measurements of the case and the monitor and made a plate in the same diameter as the monitor's base, and with feet that rises it up about 2/4 of an inch, that way ensuring the airflow to the fan. Pop the G-code into the 3D printer and let it do its magic overnight. Seven hours later, the print is ready. Put on some new rubber feet to make sure it doesn't slide around, and we are done. So here it is, all finished and ready for testing. The screen used is an AOC 23.6-inch LED monitor, 1 millisecond response time, standard full HD resolution, but I was still really happy with this. It has really nice, crisp colors, matching the iMac screen pretty well, and as an added bonus being 2 inches bigger. The speakers are Logitech Z120s, and for their size, they play really well. I found these at a local auction site secondhand for around $4. And while it's all standing there looking great, let's get down to numbers. let's see how this build actually compares to that mid-2017 iMac in a couple of benchmarks. For that, I will be using 3 pretty common pieces of software that not only are free but run cross-platform: Geekbench, Cinebench, and Unigine Heaven. Let's start off with Geekbench. This is a CPU and memory intensive test where, not surprisingly, the old iMac fell behind. It got a score of 1960 in single core and 3413 in multi-core. The mid-2017, not surprisingly, got a 4441 single core and a 9073 multi-core. But my 736 build got a 4867 in single core and a 9630 in multi-core, which is 400 and 600 points more than the iMac. Next up is Cinebench. Here, the old iMac continued its descent into oblivion with a score of 161 and a whopping 5.21 frames, which is really not a lot. The mid-2017 iMac did a 383 score and a 55.83 frames, which honestly was kinda disappointing to me because my build did a 419 and a 50.67 frames. And 50.67 frames, that's only 10% off from the 640. I would expect to beat it in the CPU score. It's a 2.3 versus a 3.9. But I also expected the iMac's HD 640 to do more than just 5 frames. Some people have suggested to me though that it can be the test in Cinebench where the processor of the iMac becomes a bottleneck, and there might actually be some truth to it, as we can see in the next test. Last up is Heaven GPU benchmark. Preset is extreme, and that is exactly what it was on the old iMac. This was probably the most painful benchmarking I have done on any computer in a long time. From the second I hit run, the GPU immediately went to 129 degrees Celsius and the system became completely unresponsive. It took me around 5 minutes just to get it to register that I was actually pressing the benchmark button in the upper left corner, and from there on out it was just still images every 3 to 4 seconds throughout the entire process. And when it finally finished, it checked in with 1 frame per second and one of the lowest scores I have ever seen of just 25. My build did considerably better with a score of 172 and 6.8 frames per second. Considering that this is not a physical graphics card, I am pretty impressed with these on-chip graphics. And last, the 2017 iMac checks in with a 219 score and 8.9 frames per second, which is much more what I would expect to see, as this is an increase of around 25 to 30%. So in all, a great build, matching up the iMac and even beating it in everything but the graphics. But was it cheaper? Did we actually save anything doing this build ourselves? Yes. And quite a lot. The 2017 iMac with the memory upgrade and the blade drive upgrade would have cost him $2,035. Our build ended up costing $963. $963! That is less than half for the same amount of power. That is amazing. And where he would have been stuck with the hardware inside the iMac, this computer actually has a lot of upgradability for years to come, making it a much better choice for the future. Well, that concludes this video. If you like what you see, please hit that like button, and if you want to see more videos, please subscribe. This is 736 signing off. See you next time.